Yeah, man. So I literally just finished the experiment yesterday. So what we did was based upon the studies, for those who aren't familiar, by Warnicki and colleagues, which is who I think is a PhD student specifically investigating the effects of stretching on hypertrophy and strength various avenues. There's actually been 7 papers published by Warnicki as a lead author on this topic. What their primary intervention is they're looking at putting people in an orthotic device or doing long duration, high intensity static stretching. So what the heck is that? Typically, the intervention they use is for an hour, being in a boot that looks very similar to a plantar fasciitis stretching boot that basically puts you into a manually stretched passive dorsiflexion. So your toes going towards your ankle. And then holding that, basically sitting in a chair with your knee straight, leg out in front of you, at the same height as the chair you're on, stretching the calf. When you first get into the stretch, the participants are rating it as an 8 out of 10 stretch discomfort, with 10 being the maximal amount of discomfort they could tolerate, and then living there for an hour. And then looking over time at how that impacts morphological adaptations, as well as strength, as well as range of motion. And the really cool findings were that in recreationally trained people and athletes, not necessarily bodybuilders doing calf raises regularly, but I don't think it'd be unreasonable to expect that some of them probably do some calf training or jump around or things like that. So not completely untrained calves. 15% increase in the first study that was published in muscle thickness in the gastrocnemius. And depending on the study you look at, between a like 10-ish to 20% increase in strength, depending on the measure used. They've looked at dynamic leg press, calf raise 1RMs, as well as isometric straight leg calf raise and bent leg calf raise, which is pretty interesting. And there's also a cross education effect. Very, very small increases in hypertrophy actually in the other leg, which are inconsistently observed and not always significant, but pretty consistently about half that increase in strength occurring in the opposite leg, even though it was not being trained nor being stretched. So, and this is in 6 weeks, which I think is pretty neat.
Yeah.
So that's the background, and that informed my interest in this because we reviewed it in mass, and I was like, that's pretty sick. I
Hmm.
want to try that. My calves haven't changed much in years, except for them shrinking when I get tired of them not changing, and just being like, I'm only going to train 3 sets a week.
Yeah.
You know, if there's one body part that I have that I don't train like a dedicated bodybuilder, I'll be honest, it has at times been my calves. More
Yeah.
so when I'm focused on strength, but when I'm in a bodybuilding phase, I do train them pretty hard. But anywho, so what we did, I'm not willing to only stretch one calf and, look like the lady in the water guy, but for his calves, or even risk it. So what we did was we did 4 weeks of baseline testing to establish my minimal change and normal variation. So anytime you're doing what's called a case study or a study on one person, where there's no comparative group and I'm not having my control leg as the control, you have to do something to establish uh, some link between the intervention and the observed effect, or you're just kind of observing holistically all that happened, which is not useless, but it's not as useful as being able to provide some type of connection to the intervention. There's a lot of limitations around a case study, but it's also pretty cool because you can take a lot more measurements. So what we did, 4 weeks in a row, I came into our lab and we did a bunch of different ultrasound sites, measures of muscle thickness, looking at the whole triceps array, the whole calf complex, both the soleus and the gastroc, measuring thickness, also looking at pennation angle, which is just the orientation of the fibers in the muscle, which tells you some things about adaptations potentially. Mostly, I'll be honest, I'm interested in the thickness changes. We also did isometric calf strength. So we used a strain gauge, which is just a device that has a chain on either end. And when you pull on them, it measures the force in newtons that is the strain being produced, quote unquote. Rigged that up to like a dip belt so I could do an isometric calf raise standing on the plate that the other end of the chain is attached to. So strength, muscle thickness, and pennation angle. And then we're also looking at increases in mobility. So we're doing what's called a knee to wall test, which is pretty cool. It looks kind of like your front leg is lunging and you keep a rubber band under your heel. You stand on it's very low tech. It's pretty cool. You stand on a tape measure, and then you see how far away from a wall in front of your leg you can be and still touch your knee to it without your rubber band popping out. And it gives you, again, it's not like standardized against other people. So you kind of have to look at the individual change because limb lengths will impact, what your score will be. But anyway, looking at how my knee to wall changes over time. So we did 4 weeks of ultrasound baseline testing. That's our primary measure. And we just wanted to see what was my normal variation. So that's going to collapse the ultrasound user's ability to have variation. So it's going to have my normal day-to-day biological variation, or week to week, we should say, and any potential change that I was experiencing before I was stretching, just doing 20 sets of calves, which was what I had been doing for a little bit. So that was so if we saw more than a whatever variation we saw in those 4 weeks, we can call that like a real change. We haven't analyzed the ultrasound data yet. So I think there's still, I'm not going to be able to report the findings yet on this podcast, unfortunately, but we did those 4 weeks. But I can plant the seed and make people very excited. And then that 4th week measurement was our pre-test. And then 6 weeks in, we did our mid-test. And then another 6 weeks later, we did our post-test. And then we waited a week, stopped stretching, and did a post test. So in total, this is a 17-week study, which is just how long they measured me for. And what I actually did for the 12 weeks was stretching each calf for 1 hour, 6 days per week. So I gave myself one off day and kept my 20 set per week training volume on calves, same modalities, just to see how they changed. And
were you
the
weaker?
data that I say again?
Were you weaker given that you were stretching so much? Like I imagine, well, you probably stretched after your workout, right?
Yeah. So generally I would, for like the first 6 weeks or so, I stretched at night so that it wouldn't, potentially negatively impact my training, because I thought it would based upon the data we have. But eventually I started doing it probably 80% of the time at night and maybe 20% of the time in the morning while I was on a podcast. So I would sometimes train 1 hour to 3 hours after the calf stretching, and I didn't actually notice a decrease in performance. It was still pretty strong. That might be because I did 7 weeks in a row, so I'd adapted to it. But the cool thing, so some of the things I can just tell you straight up, the data we do have is we have the strength measurements, so my isometric calf strength, how that changed over time, and also my range of motion. And those things went up pretty substantially. So I put about 300 newtons on my isometric calf strength, which doesn't mean a whole lot to people, but it was basically a 15% increase in calf isometric strength.
Okay.
Is that right? Yeah, if it's like 2000 at baseline, yes, that's 15%. Math is hard. And my flexibility went up by 3 centimeters, which is a fair bit on in the knee to wall test. And I totally noticed that change.
Yeah.
Leg press, I was getting deeper. Squats, I was getting deeper. At home, I have sometimes I do a single leg press calf raise, and there's a part of the sled that my heel could theoretically contact. It never did before, but now at the bottom of those calf raises, my heel actually touches that sometimes. I also think my hamstrings got more flexible because I was, the position you're in to stretch the calf is basically like a sort of like a sit and reach test, but you're not sitting and reaching forward. So I've started to occasionally touch the plate to the ground on RDLs, and I have good RDL form. I'm not actually letting my knees track forward,
Right.
So, yeah, I've definitely noticed increases in range of motion. My strength has gone up. And visually, it seems like my calves are bigger. The circumference measurements, we didn't get enough baseline tests to really have like an idea of like the variability. And I had to have 2 different people measure them because one was away because we didn't start this at the ideal time. So one of my circumference measurements was done like right during the holidays, and it wasn't done by the same person. So it's possible my circumference went up, but it's also within like the between rater variability we have.